The fluorescent lights of Miller's music shop cast a harsh glow over the dusty guitar cases, creating shadows that seemed to dance between the rows of instruments. Pete Rose ran his calloused fingers along the neck of a vintage Martin D28, feeling the smooth wood beneath his weathered hands. At 68, his once powerful frame had softened, but his eyes still held the fire that had made him a legend on the baseball diamond decades ago. "You gonna buy that one or just keep fondling it?" chuckled Mike Miller, the shop owner, from behind the counter. His gray beard was speckled with sawdust from the repair work he'd been doing all morning. Pete looked up, a wry smile crossing his face. "Just remembering, Mike. This reminds me of the one I had back in '75. Sold it when I needed the money for, well, you know." Mike nodded knowingly. Everyone in Cincinnati knew Pete's story, the gambling, the ban from baseball, the years of struggle that followed. But here, in this small music shop tucked away in the North Side neighborhood, Pete had found something he'd lost long ago: peace. "Been coming here for 3 months now," Pete said, carefully placing the guitar back on its stand. "Never thought I'd find solace in 6 strings instead of 4 basses." The bell above the door chimed, and an elderly couple entered, moving slowly, but with purpose. The woman, perhaps in her 70s, wore a faded blue cardigan despite the Ohio September heat. Her husband, tall and gaunt, leaned heavily on a wooden cane, his left leg clearly giving him trouble. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "We're looking for someone who might be able to help us with something musical." Mike looked up from his work. "What can I do for you folks?" The man cleared his throat. "My name is Harold Thompson, and this is my wife, Margaret. We're looking for someone who might know a particular song. It's rather important to us." Pete found himself drawn to the couple. Something in their demeanor, the way they held each other's hands, reminded him of his own grandparents. He'd always been good at reading people, a skill that had served him well in baseball and, unfortunately, in his gambling days. "What song?" Pete asked, stepping closer. Margaret's eyes brightened slightly. "It's called September Song. My Harold used to play it for me on his guitar when we were young. We just celebrated our 53rd wedding anniversary, and Harold's been diagnosed with Parkinson's. His hands shake too much now to play." Harold squeezed his wife's hand gently. "The doctor says I might not have much time left where I can still be myself. Margaret has been asking if I could play it one more time, but I just can't manage the chords anymore." The shop fell silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Pete felt something stir in his chest, a familiar ache that came whenever he was reminded of time's relentless march. He'd spent so many years focused on his own regrets, his own losses, that he'd forgotten how to recognize genuine love when it stood right in front of him. "I know that song," Pete said quietly. "Been playing it myself lately, actually." Margaret's face lit up with hope. "Really? Could you possibly play it? I know it's a strange request from complete strangers, but—" "Nothing strange about it," Pete interrupted gently. He looked at Mike, who nodded toward the back room where they kept the better instruments for serious players. "Tell you what," Pete continued, "why don't we sit down back there, and I'll see what I can do." "Mike, can we borrow that, Martin?" "For this? Absolutely." Mike carefully lifted the guitar Pete had been admiring. "Take all the time you need." As they made their way to the small seating area in the back of the shop, Pete learned more about Harold and Margaret. They'd met in 1970 at a USO dance at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Harold had been a young airman, recently returned from Vietnam, and Margaret was a nurse at the base hospital. Their first dance had been to September Song, played by a small military band. Harold was so nervous, Margaret recalled, settling into one of the worn leather chairs Mike kept for customers. His hands were shaking worse than they do now, and he kept apologizing for stepping on my feet. Harold chuckled, the sound slightly raspy. I was terrified. This beautiful woman had agreed to dance with me, and I was convinced I was going to make a fool of myself. But then the song came on, Margaret continued, and something changed. Harold relaxed, and we just moved together like we'd been dancing for years. Pete listened as he tuned the guitar, each story adding weight to the moment. He'd always believed that music had power, but sitting here with this couple, he was beginning to understand it in a way he never had before. "The thing is," Harold said, his voice growing softer, "that song has been our song ever since. I taught myself to play it on guitar during our first year of marriage. Every anniversary, every special moment, I'd play it for Margaret. When our son was born, when he graduated, when he got married, it was always our soundtrack." Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I just wanted to hear it one more time, played with love, the way Harold used to play it for me." Pete finished tuning and looked up at the couple. In Harold's eyes, he saw something he recognized from his own mirror, the fear of being forgotten, of leaving behind only disappointment and regret. In Margaret's, he saw unwavering devotion, the kind he'd searched for his entire life, but had been too stubborn or too damaged to accept when it was offered. "Before I play," Pete said, "I want you to know something. I'm Pete Rose. You might know the name." Harold's eyes widened slightly. "Charlie Hustle. I watched you play for years. Then you know I made some mistakes, big ones, lost a lot because of them." Pete adjusted his grip on the guitar. "But sitting here with you two, hearing your story, it reminds me that some things are more important than the mistakes we make. Some things are worth celebrating, even when the world seems determined to focus on what we've done wrong." Margaret reached over and squeezed Pete's hand briefly. "We all make mistakes, dear. What matters is what we do with the time we have left." Pete nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. He positioned his fingers on the fretboard, took a deep breath, and began to play. The opening notes of September's song filled the small space, clear and precise. Pete's voice, weathered by age and hardship but still strong, joined the melody. "Oh, it's a long, long while from May to December." As he sang, Pete watched the couple transform before his eyes. Harold sat up straighter, his trembling hands growing still as he focused on the music. Margaret closed her eyes, a peaceful smile spreading across her face as the familiar melody washed over her. The song continued, each note carrying decades of memory, love, and loss. Pete found himself thinking of his own life, the triumphs and failures, the people he'd loved and lost, the chances he'd missed because he was too focused on the next game, the next bet, the next opportunity to prove himself. And the days dwindled down to a precious few. As the final notes faded, the shop fell into a profound silence. Margaret was crying softly, but her tears were mixed with joy and gratitude. Harold had tears streaming down his face as well, his hand reaching out to touch his wife's cheek. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. That was perfect." Harold cleared his throat, struggling with emotion. "In 53 years, I don't think I ever played it quite that beautifully." Pete set the guitar down carefully, his own eyes moist. "I think," he said quietly, "that was exactly what I needed to remember about why music matters." As the afternoon wore on, the three of them talked about life, love, and the passages of time that bring both sorrow and unexpected gifts. Pete learned that Harold had been a mechanic after leaving the Air Force, working for 40 years at a local garage. Margaret had spent her career as a pediatric nurse, bringing comfort to countless children and families. "We never had children of our own," Margaret explained. "It just never happened for us. But we had each other, and that always felt like enough." Pete thought about his own children, the relationship strained by his gambling, and the years of controversy that followed. He wondered if he'd ever been as present for them as Harold and Margaret had been for each other. When it was time for the couple to leave, Harold shook Pete's hand firmly. "This meant more to us than you could possibly know." "It meant more to me too," Pete replied, and he found that he truly meant it. As Margaret hugged him goodbye, she whispered, "Don't give up on yourself, Pete. It's never too late to write a better ending to your story." After they left, Pete sat in the quiet shop with Mike, both men processing what had just occurred. "You know," Mike said finally, "I've been running this place for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like that." Pete nodded, still holding the Martin guitar. "Makes you think about what really matters, doesn't it?" "You thinking about buying that guitar now?" Mike asked with a knowing smile. Pete looked down at the instrument, then at the empty chairs where Harold and Margaret had sat. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think I am." 3 days after his encounter with Harold and Margaret, Pete found himself walking through Fountain Square in downtown Cincinnati with the Martin guitar case slung over his shoulder. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Office workers hurried past, clutching coffee cups and checking their phones, but Pete moved at a more deliberate pace, his mind still processing the profound impact of that afternoon in the music shop. He'd purchased the guitar that same day, spending money he'd been saving for months. It was an impulsive decision by his usual standards. Pete had learned the hard way to be careful with financial choices, but something about the moment had felt right in a way that transcended practical considerations. His destination was the Cincinnati Library's main branch, where he'd been volunteering for the past year as part of his community service. It wasn't court-ordered anymore. He'd completed those requirements long ago, but Pete had discovered that helping kids with reading and homework gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his playing days. "Mr. Pete!" called out Jalen, a 10-year-old boy with bright eyes and a gap-toothed grin. "You brought your guitar." Pete smiled as he approached the children's section, where a small group of kids had gathered for the weekly reading program. Lisa Martinez, the librarian who coordinated the program, looked up from arranging books on a low table. "I wasn't expecting a concert today," she said with a warm smile. Lisa was in her 40s, with graying hair and the patient demeanor that came from years of working with children. She'd been one of the few people who'd welcomed Pete without judgment when he'd first started volunteering. "Neither was I," Pete admitted, setting down the guitar case. "But I've been thinking about something that happened earlier this week, and I thought maybe music might help with today's lesson." The children, 6 kids ranging from 8 to 12 years old, all participants in the library's after-school program for underprivileged youth, gathered around with curious excitement. Pete had been working with this same group for months, helping them with homework and listening to them practice reading aloud. "What happened?" asked Maria, a 9-year-old whose family had moved to Cincinnati from Guatemala the previous year. Her English had improved dramatically since Pete had started working with her, though she still spoke with careful precision. Pete opened the guitar case, revealing the beautiful Martin. "I met an elderly couple who taught me something important about love and music and time. Would you like to hear about it?" As Pete tuned the guitar, he told the children about Harold and Margaret, simplifying the story for their young ears, but keeping the emotional core intact. He talked about how music could carry memories and feelings across decades, how a simple song could be more precious than any trophy or award. "My grandma sings to me in Spanish," Maria said thoughtfully. "She says, music helps us remember who we are, even when we're far from home." "That's exactly right," Pete said, adjusting the tuning pegs. "Music is like a bridge between our hearts and our memories." Jalen raised his hand. "Mr. Pete, you were really famous, weren't you? My dad says you were the best baseball player ever." Pete paused, considering his response carefully. These children knew parts of his story. It was impossible to hide his identity in Cincinnati, but he'd always been honest with them about his mistakes while focusing on the lessons learned rather than dwelling on past failures. "I was good at baseball," Pete said slowly. "But being good at something doesn't make you a good person automatically. I made some bad choices that hurt a lot of people, including myself. What I'm learning now is that it's never too late to try to do better. Like when I got in trouble for fighting with Tommy, but then I apologized and we became friends again?" asked Deshawn, an 8-year-old with expressive eyes and a quick smile. "Exactly like that," Pete agreed. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is admit we were wrong and then try to make things better." He began to play a simple melody, nothing as complex as September Song, but something the children might recognize. As his fingers found the chords, Pete started singing "What a Wonderful World," his voice gentle and unpracticed but sincere. The children listened intently, some swaying slightly to the rhythm. Lisa watched from nearby, noting how Pete's presence seemed to calm and focus the group in a way she rarely saw during their regular sessions. When the song ended, Maria raised her hand shyly. "Mr. Pete, could you teach us to play?" "I'm not really a teacher," Pete said, but he saw the hope in their faces and reconsidered. "But maybe I could show you a few simple chords. Would that be okay, Ms. Lisa?" Lisa nodded enthusiastically. "I think that sounds wonderful. We have some smaller guitars in the music room that the children could use." Over the next hour, Pete found himself leading an impromptu music lesson. He showed the children how to hold the guitar properly, how to position their fingers for basic chords, and how to strum with a gentle but confident motion. Their small hands struggled with the unfamiliar shapes, but their enthusiasm more than made up for their lack of technique. "Music is like reading," Pete explained, as he helped Deshawn position his fingers on the fretboard. "At first, it feels impossible, but the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. And eventually, instead of just making sounds or saying words, you're expressing feelings and ideas." Jalen managed to produce a reasonably clear G chord and grinned with pride. "I did it! I made music!" "You absolutely did," Pete confirmed, feeling an unexpected surge of joy at the boy's accomplishment. "Keep practicing, and soon you'll be able to play songs that mean something special to you." As the session wound down, Lisa pulled Pete aside. "I've never seen them so engaged," she said quietly. "There's something different about you today, more present, I guess." Pete glanced back at the children, who were still experimenting with the guitars, their faces bright with concentration and delight. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what matters," he said. "For so long, I've been focused on what I lost, what I couldn't get back. But these kids, and that couple I met, they're helping me see what I still have to give." Have you thought about making this a regular part of your volunteer work?" Lisa asked. "I know we could arrange for music lessons to be part of our programming. The children clearly respond to you, and they need positive male role models." The suggestion caught Pete off guard. He'd never thought of himself as a role model. Quite the opposite, in fact. But looking at the children's faces, seeing their eagerness to learn and their unconscious trust in him, he felt something shift inside his chest. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that a lot." After the children were picked up by parents or headed home on their own, Pete stayed to help Lisa clean up the music room. As they put away the small guitars and straightened the chairs, she shared more about the kids' backgrounds. "Maria's family is still adjusting to life here," Lisa explained. "Her father works 2 jobs and her mother is trying to learn English while caring for 3 children. Music might be a way for Maria to express herself when words feel difficult." "And Jalen?" "Single mother, works nights at the hospital. His grandmother usually picks him up, but she's been having health problems lately. He's been acting out at school, probably because he's worried about his family situation." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "What about Deshawn?" "Foster care. He's been with his current family for 6 months, the longest placement he's had in 2 years. He's brilliant but struggles with trust. Today was the first time I've seen him really open up to an adult. As they locked up the library, Pete found himself thinking about these children and their challenges. He'd always known, intellectually, that his problems weren't the only ones in the world, but somehow the combination of meeting Harold and Margaret and working with these kids was making that knowledge feel more real and immediate. Walking home through the darkening streets of Cincinnati, Pete passed Riverfront Stadium, now demolished and replaced by newer venues, but still present in his memory as the place where he'd experienced some of his greatest triumphs. For years, walking past baseball-related sites had filled him with bitterness and regret. Tonight, for the first time, he felt something different: gratitude. He'd been given extraordinary talents and opportunities, and yes, he'd squandered many of them through poor choices. But he was still here, still healthy enough to make a difference in small but meaningful ways. The children at the library didn't care about his gambling scandal or his exclusion from the Hall of Fame. They saw him as Mr. Pete, the man who helped them with their homework, and now, apparently, the man who could teach them to make music. When he reached his small apartment, Pete set the guitar case carefully in the corner and made himself a simple dinner. As he ate, he thought about Harold and Margaret, wondering how Harold was feeling, whether the Parkinson's symptoms were progressing, whether Margaret was finding ways to cope with the fear and uncertainty that came with such a diagnosis. On impulse, he picked up his phone and called information. "Cincinnati, Ohio," he said, when the operator answered. "Harold Thompson." There were 3 Harold Thompsons listed, but only one in the zip code that matched the address he'd glimpsed on the medical forms Harold had been carrying at the music shop. Pete hesitated for a moment, then dialed the number. "Hello?" Margaret's voice was cautious but polite. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Pete Rose. We met at Miller's music shop a few days ago." "Pete, oh, how wonderful to hear from you. Harold will be so pleased. How are you, dear?" "I'm well, thank you. I was actually calling to check on you and Harold. I've been thinking about you both." There was a brief pause, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "That's so kind of you. Harold's been having a difficult few days. The medication adjustments are challenging. But he keeps talking about that afternoon. He says it reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place." "I was wondering," Pete said, surprising himself with the words as they emerged. "Would you and Harold be interested in joining me for something this Saturday? I've started helping with music lessons at the library, working with some kids from the community. I thought Harold might enjoy meeting them, and they'd probably love to hear some of his stories." "Oh, Pete, that sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure Harold is up for—" "Margaret?" Harold's voice came from the background, muffled but audible. "Is that Pete Rose?" Pete heard the phone being passed, and then Harold's voice, weaker than it had been a few days earlier, but still warm. "Pete, my boy, how are you?" "I'm good, Harold. I was just telling Margaret about some kids I work with at the library. They're learning to play guitar, and I thought you might enjoy meeting them." "More kids learning guitar?" Harold's voice perked up noticeably. "Margaret, did you hear that? Maybe I could... Well, I can't play anymore, but I could still share what I know about music." In the background, Pete heard Margaret's gentle voice. "Harold, we should ask Dr. Peterson if it's okay for you to—" "Margaret, love, some things are more important than doctor's orders." "Pete, when did you say this was?" "Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. But only if you're feeling up to it, and only if your doctor thinks it's okay." "I'll be there," Harold said firmly. "It'll do me good to be around music again." After they hung up, Pete sat in his quiet apartment, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. He'd spent so many years focused inward, consumed by his own disappointments and regrets. Now, almost without realizing it, he was building connections with children who needed guidance, with an elderly couple facing their own challenges, with a community that might finally be ready to see him as something more than his past mistakes. He picked up the Martin guitar and began to play September Song again, thinking about the way Harold and Margaret had looked at each other, the way the children's faces had lit up when they managed their first chords, the way music seemed to create bridges between people who might otherwise remain strangers. For the first time in years, Pete Rose felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Saturday arrived with a crisp autumn clarity, the kind of October day that makes Cincinnati beautiful despite its industrial edges. Pete arrived at the library 30 minutes early, carrying his guitar and a folder of simple chord charts he'd printed at home. His palms were slightly sweaty, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his rookie season with the Reds. Lisa was already there, setting up chairs in a semicircle in the library's community room. The space was larger than their usual meeting area, with tall windows that let in the golden afternoon light and walls lined with children's artwork from various library programs. "Nervous?" Lisa asked, noticing Pete's unusually quiet demeanor. "A little," Pete admitted. "I keep thinking about Harold and Margaret driving over here, and I hope this isn't too much for them. And the kids. What if they don't connect? What if I'm pushing something that should happen naturally?" Lisa paused in her chair arrangement and looked at Pete with gentle amusement. "You know, in all the months you've been volunteering here, I've never heard you second-guess yourself like this. Usually you just jump in and figure things out as you go. Usually I'm just helping with homework and reading. This feels bigger somehow." Before Lisa could respond, the children began arriving. Maria came first, with her older brother Carlos, who typically dropped her off and picked her up. Jalen arrived with his grandmother, a dignified woman in her 70s who walked with a cane but moved with purpose. Deshawn came with his foster mother, Sarah, a kind-faced woman in her 40s who'd been working hard to provide stability for the boy. "Mr. Pete," Jalen called out, his voice echoing in the larger space. "Are we really going to have a concert?" "Not exactly a concert," Pete said, kneeling down to Jalen's eye level. "More like a music-sharing session. I've invited some friends to join us, an elderly couple who know a lot about music and love. I thought you might enjoy meeting them." Maria raised her hand shyly. "Mr. Pete, I practiced the chords you showed us. Want to see?" Before Pete could respond, the main door opened and Harold entered, supported by Margaret's steady arm. He moved more slowly than he had at the music shop, and Pete could see that the Parkinson's symptoms were more pronounced today. But Harold's eyes were bright with interest as he took in the room and the gathering children. "Harold! Margaret!" Pete stood and crossed to greet them. "I'm so glad you could make it. How are you feeling today?" "Like I'm about to have an adventure," Harold replied, his voice slightly shaky but determined. "Margaret was worried I wouldn't be up for it, but honestly, I've been looking forward to this all week." Margaret smiled, though Pete could see the concern in her eyes. The drive was fine, and Harold insisted on bringing something to share with the children. She held up a worn leather folder. Some of Harold's old sheet music and songbooks from when he first started learning guitar. He thought the children might be interested in seeing how people learned music before YouTube tutorials. Pete felt a warmth spread through his chest. "That's perfect. Kids, come meet my friends Harold and Margaret Thompson." The children gathered around somewhat shyly at first, but their natural curiosity quickly overcame their reserve. Margaret, with her years of nursing experience, seemed to understand intuitively how to interact with them. She knelt down despite her age and began asking them about their favorite songs and whether they'd ever tried to play music before. Harold settled into one of the chairs, and Pete noticed how the man's tremor seemed to lessen when he focused on the children. "So," Harold said, addressing the group, "Pete tells me you've been learning to play guitar. That's wonderful. I learned when I was probably not much older than you are now." Deshawn, usually the most reserved of the group, stepped closer. "Were you famous like Mr. Pete?" Harold chuckled. "Not famous like Pete, no. But music made me famous in a different way. It helped me win the heart of this beautiful lady." He gestured toward Margaret with a smile that made her blush like a teenager. "Tell them about the USO dance," Margaret suggested. As Harold recounted the story of their first meeting, Pete watched the children's faces. They listened with rapt attention to this tale of young love and nervous first dances, the kind of romantic story that seemed to belong to a different world from their own experiences, but that somehow felt universal in its emotional truth. "The thing about music," Harold concluded, "is that it can take you back to any moment, any feeling. When I hear September Song, that's the song we dance to. I'm 22 years old again, scared to death but hopeful about everything." Maria raised her hand. "My grandma says music is like a bridge to our hearts." "Your grandmother is a very wise woman," Margaret said warmly. "What kind of music does she share with you?" "Songs from Guatemala, in Spanish. She says they help me remember where I come from, even though this is my home now." Pete watched this exchange with growing amazement. He'd hoped Harold and Margaret would enjoy meeting the children, but he hadn't anticipated how naturally the conversation would flow, how the stories and experiences would weave together to create something richer than what any of them could have provided individually. "Should we make some music?" Pete suggested, picking up his guitar. For the next hour, the community room filled with the sounds of learning and laughter. Pete showed the children the basic chords again, while Harold, despite his trembling hands, demonstrated finger positions and shared tips about how to make chord changes more smoothly. "The secret," Harold told Jalen, who was struggling with the transition from G to C, "is to keep your thumb in the right position on the back of the neck. Like this. Well, like Pete is showing you. My hands aren't quite up to demonstrating anymore." Instead of showing frustration at his limitations, Harold seemed energized by his ability to share knowledge verbally. He had decades of experience to draw upon, stories about learning songs by ear before the internet, techniques for developing finger strength and flexibility, insights about how different songs required different approaches. Margaret, meanwhile, had taken on the role of encourager and cheerleader. She moved from child to child, offering gentle corrections and enthusiastic praise when they managed to produce clear notes or make successful chord changes. "Deshawn, that sounded beautiful," she exclaimed when the boy managed to strum through a simple progression. "You have natural rhythm." The boy beamed under her attention, and Pete noticed how he seemed to stand a little taller, hold the guitar with more confidence. When they took a break for juice and cookies that Lisa had provided, Harold opened his folder of sheet music and songbooks. The children gathered around as he showed them handwritten chord charts, yellowed pages with penciled-in notes and corrections, and photographs from various performances and jam sessions from decades past. "This is from 1973, Harold said, pointing to a photo of himself with a group of other young men, all holding guitars. "We used to get together every Friday night in Jimmy Patterson's garage. We thought we were going to be the next big thing." "What happened?" Carlos asked. He'd been hanging around the edges of the group, too cool at 13 to fully participate, but clearly interested despite himself. "Life happened," Harold replied with good humor. "I met Margaret, got married, started a family we hoped for but never had, found a job I was good at. Music became something I did for joy rather than ambition, and honestly, I think that made it more meaningful, not less." Pete found himself thinking about his own relationship with baseball, how the pressure and ambition had sometimes drained the joy out of the game he'd loved as a child. Here was Harold, who'd never achieved fame or fortune through music, but who'd maintained a pure love for it across 5 decades. "Mr. Harold," Maria said, "could you tell us about some of the songs in your books?" Harold's face lit up. "I'd be delighted to. This one here, House of the Rising Sun, was one of the first songs I learned to play all the way through, And this one, Blackbird by the Beatles, was the song Margaret requested most often when I'd play for her in the evenings. And as Harold shared stories about different songs, their histories, their meanings, the memories associated with learning and playing them, Pete realized he was witnessing something remarkable. The old man was passing down not just musical knowledge, but a way of thinking about music as a companion through life's joys and sorrows. Music isn't just about entertainment, Harold explained to the attentive children. It's about connection. When you learn to play a song, you're connecting with everyone who's ever played it before you and everyone who'll play it after you're gone. You become part of something larger than yourself. Jalen raised his hand. Like when we sing Happy Birthday to someone, everyone knows that song. Exactly, Harold exclaimed. That's a perfect example. That simple little song connects people all over the world. It's one of the first songs most children learn, and it brings joy to people throughout their entire lives. As the session began to wind down, Pete suggested they try playing something together. A simple song that would allow everyone to participate at their own level. He chose This Land Is Your Land, a song most of the children knew and that used only basic chords. Harold couldn't play, but he led the singing with a voice that, while shakier than it once was, still carried the melody with confidence and joy. Margaret clapped along, her face radiant with happiness, as she watched her husband share his passion with the next generation. The children strummed their guitars with varying degrees of success, but their enthusiasm more than made up for any technical shortcomings. Pete, playing the lead guitar part, felt a profound sense of rightness as the voices and instruments blended together. This wasn't about performance or achievement or proving anything to anyone. This was about community, about sharing something beautiful simply for the sake of sharing it. When the song ended, the room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by Margaret's soft applause. That, she said, her eyes bright with tears, was absolutely wonderful. Harold nodded, visibly tired but deeply satisfied. Thank you all for letting an old man pretend he's still a music teacher. This has been one of the best afternoons I've had in a very long time. As families began arriving to pick up the children, Pete helped Harold and Margaret gather their belongings. Margaret pulled him aside as Harold was saying goodbye to each child individually. Pete, I can't thank you enough for this. Harold has been struggling lately, not just with the physical symptoms, but with feeling like he doesn't have anything left to offer the world. Today reminded him that his knowledge and experience still matter. He gave as much to those kids as they gave to him, Pete replied, maybe more. That's what makes it so beautiful, Margaret agreed. And you've changed since we met you at the music shop. You seem more at peace with yourself. Pete considered her observation. I think I'm finally learning the difference between being important and being useful. I spent so many years focused on being important, being famous, being recognized, being remembered. These kids don't care about any of that. They just want someone to teach them something new and to believe in them. Harold rejoined them, moving slowly but with obvious contentment. Pete, my boy, would you be interested in doing this again sometime? I have more music to share, more stories. And these children, they're hungry to learn. I'd love that, Pete said immediately. Lisa and I were already talking about making music a regular part of the program. Having you involved would make it something really special. As he watched Harold and Margaret make their careful way to their car, Pete felt a profound shift in his understanding of what the rest of his life might look like. For years, he'd been focused on what he'd lost, what doors had been closed to him, what recognition had been denied. Now he was beginning to see possibilities he'd never considered. Ways to be useful, ways to give back, ways to build relationships based on genuine care rather than mutual benefit. Mr. Pete, Deshawn's voice interrupted his thoughts. The boy was standing nearby with his foster mother, Sarah, both of them waiting while she finished a conversation with Lisa. Yeah, buddy? That was really cool today. Mr. Harold knows a lot about music. He does indeed. Did you learn something new? Deshawn nodded seriously. He told me that when you're learning to play, it's okay to make mistakes, because that's how you figure out what sounds right. He said even famous musicians make mistakes all the time. Pete smiled, recognizing Harold's wisdom in reframing error as part of the learning process rather than as failure. That's very true. Some of my best baseball plays came after I made errors that taught me something new. Really? Really. The key is to keep trying, keep learning, and not let the mistakes stop you from playing the game. Deshawn nodded thoughtfully, then surprised Pete by stepping forward and giving him a quick hug before hurrying to catch up with Sarah. As Pete packed up his guitar, he reflected on the afternoon's events. He'd brought Harold and Margaret together with the children, hoping to create a meaningful experience for everyone involved. What he hadn't expected was how much he himself would learn from watching the interactions unfold. Harold had shown him that expertise didn't always require physical ability, that knowledge and experience could be shared in ways that transcended current limitations. Margaret had demonstrated how love could be expressed through supporting someone else's passion, even when that passion was no longer what it once was. And the children had reminded him that enthusiasm and openness to learning could transform even the simplest activities into something profound. Walking home through the Cincinnati streets as the sun set behind the downtown skyline, Pete felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about tomorrow. He had plans to research more songs that would be appropriate for the children's skill level, ideas for bringing in other community members who might have knowledge or stories to share, and a growing sense that he'd stumbled upon something that could become a lasting legacy. Not the kind built on statistics and records, but the kind built on relationships and positive impact on individual lives. That evening, he called his daughter Fawn, something he'd been doing more regularly in recent months as their relationship slowly healed from years of strain and misunderstanding. "Dad, how are you? You sound different tonight." "I'm good, honey, really good. I wanted to tell you about something that happened today." As Pete described the afternoon's music session, sharing stories about Harold and Margaret and the children, Fawn listened with obvious surprise and growing warmth. "Dad, you sound happier than I've heard you in years. This music thing, it really means something to you, doesn't it?" "It does," Pete admitted. "I think I'm finally figuring out what I want to do with the rest of my life. Not trying to get back into baseball, not fighting old battles, just being useful in whatever way I can." "I'm proud of you," Fawn said softly. "Mom would be too." After they hung up, Pete sat in his small living room with the Martin guitar across his lap, practicing the songs he wanted to teach the children next week. The notes filled the quiet apartment, carrying with them the promise of more afternoons like today, more connections to be made, more opportunities to discover that sometimes the most meaningful victories come, not from what you achieve for yourself, but from what you help others discover they can achieve for themselves. 2 weeks later, Pete arrived at the library to find an unexpected addition to their usual Saturday music group. Sitting slightly apart from the children was a teenage boy, perhaps 16 or 17, with dark hair that fell across his eyes and a posture that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "That's Marcus," Lisa explained quietly, as Pete set up his guitar. "He's Carlos's cousin. Maria's family is helping care for him while his mother is in rehab. He usually waits outside during the sessions, but today he asked if he could come in and listen." Pete nodded, remembering his own teenage years and the careful balance between wanting to be included and needing to maintain an image of indifference. "Has he shown any interest in music before?" "Carlos says he used to play guitar, but he stopped about a year ago when his family situation got difficult." Harold and Margaret had become regular attendees, arriving each week with new stories and songs to share. Today, Harold was having what Margaret called a good day. His tremor was less pronounced, and he seemed more alert and engaged than he'd been the previous week. "Who's our new friend?" Margaret asked warmly, nodding toward Marcus. "That's Marcus," Pete said. "Carlos's cousin. He's going through a tough time, but Lisa says he used to play guitar." Margaret's expression softened with understanding. One of those situations. I've seen it before. Young people who've had to put away the things they love because love itself started to feel too risky. As the session began, Pete noticed Marcus watching intently despite his apparent disinterest. When Pete demonstrated chord progressions, Marcus's fingers moved slightly against his thigh, as if remembering familiar patterns. When Harold told stories about learning to play, Marcus leaned forward almost imperceptibly. The regular attendees had progressed significantly over the past few weeks. Maria could now transition between G, C, and D chords with confidence, and she'd started humming along with melodies in a sweet, clear voice. Jalen had discovered that he had a natural sense of rhythm and had begun experimenting with different strumming patterns. Deshawn, who'd initially been the most tentative, had surprised everyone by learning to play the opening riff to House of the Rising Sun with remarkable accuracy. "Today," Pete announced, "I thought we might try something a little different. Harold has been teaching me about harmony, how different voices can work together to make music richer and more beautiful." Harold nodded enthusiastically. Pete's being modest. He's got a natural ear for harmony. "Margaret and I were talking about it on the drive over." "What's harmony?" asked Maria. "It's when people sing different notes at the same time, but the notes work together to sound even better than they would alone," Margaret explained. "Like in a family, everyone has their own voice and their own role, but when they work together, they create something beautiful." Pete demonstrated by playing a simple chord progression, while Harold, despite his shakier voice, sang the main melody of Amazing Grace. Then Pete added a harmony line, his voice blending with Harold's, to create something richer and more complex than either voice alone. The children were fascinated, and several of them wanted to try singing harmony immediately. Pete worked with them patiently, explaining how to listen for the chord tones and find notes that would complement rather than compete with the melody. Throughout this instruction, Pete was aware of Marcus watching from his chair at the back of the room. The teenager's expression had shifted from studied indifference to genuine interest, though he was clearly trying to hide his engagement. After about 40 minutes of music making, Pete called for their usual break. As the children scattered to get juice and crackers, Pete noticed Marcus standing up and moving closer to examine one of the smaller guitars they kept available for the kids to use. "You can pick it up if you want," Pete said casually, approaching without making it seem like a big deal. Marcus glanced around to make sure no one else was watching, then lifted the guitar and automatically positioned it correctly against his body. His left hand found the neck with the unconscious ease of someone who'd spent significant time practicing. "How long did you play?" Pete asked quietly. "Couple of years," Marcus replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Started when I was 13. My mom got me lessons for my birthday." "What kind of music did you like to play?" Marcus shrugged, but Pete could see a flicker of enthusiasm break through his protective facade. "Little bit of everything. Some rock, some folk stuff, some Spanish guitar. My teacher was from Mexico, and he taught me some classical techniques. Would you mind showing me something? I'm always looking to learn new approaches." The invitation seemed to catch Marcus off guard. Pete could see him weighing the desire to play against the risk of caring about something again, of opening himself up to potential disappointment or loss. "I'm pretty rusty," Marcus said finally. "Rust comes off," Pete replied with a smile. "Trust me, I know something about that." Marcus sat down and spent a moment tuning the guitar with practiced efficiency. Then, Almost without seeming to make a conscious decision, he began to play. The melody that emerged was complex and beautiful, incorporating elements of classical Spanish guitar technique with contemporary chord progressions. His fingers moved with muscle memory across the fretboard, finding harmonies and runs that spoke of hours of dedicated practice and natural talent. The entire room gradually fell silent as Marcus played, even the children stopping their conversations to listen. The music was sophisticated, far beyond what any of them had been working on, but it wasn't showy or intended to impress. It was simply beautiful, played with a maturity and emotional depth that surprised Pete. When Marcus finished, the room remained quiet for a moment before breaking into spontaneous applause. Marcus looked startled, as if he'd forgotten anyone else was there. "That was extraordinary," Harold said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Marcus flushed slightly. "My teacher, Miguel Santos. He had a studio downtown. He taught me that piece. It's called Recuerdos de la Alhambra. It means Memories of the Alhambra." "I know that piece," Margaret said softly. "Harold tried to learn it years ago. It's quite advanced." "Miguel said I had good hands for classical guitar," Marcus explained, then seemed to catch himself being too enthusiastic. He started to hand the guitar back to Pete. "Anyway, that was a while ago." "Why did you stop taking lessons?" Pete asked gently. Marcus's expression closed off again. "Things changed. Family stuff. Miguel's studio closed anyway. He moved back to Mexico to take care of his parents." Pete nodded, recognizing the pain behind the casual words. "I'm sorry. It sounds like you had a good teacher and that you really loved playing." "Yeah, well, stuff doesn't always work out the way you want it to." The bitter edge in Marcus's voice was familiar to Pete. He'd heard it in his own voice for years after his gambling scandal broke and his world fell apart. It was the sound of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment and was trying to protect themselves from caring too much about anything. "No, it doesn't," Pete agreed. "But sometimes new opportunities show up when you're not looking for them." Before Marcus could respond, Maria approached them with her guitar. "Marcus, could you show me how you made your fingers move so fast? I can barely switch between two chords." Marcus looked at the 9-year-old's earnest face, and Pete saw his defensive walls waver. "It's not really about speed," he said, his voice gentling. "It's about practicing the movements slowly until your fingers remember them. Then you can gradually increase the tempo. Could you show me?" Marcus glanced at Pete, who nodded encouragingly. "Sure, I guess. Do you know how to do a basic finger-picking pattern?" For the rest of the session, Marcus found himself drawn into teaching the other children more advanced techniques. Pete and Harold watched with satisfaction as the teenagers' natural teaching instincts emerged. He was patient with the younger kids, encouraging when they struggled, and generous with sharing the knowledge he'd gained during his years of lessons with Miguel. "He's a natural teacher," Harold observed quietly to Pete. "Look how the children respond to him," Pete nodded, "and look how he responds to them. He's been carrying a lot of pain, but sharing music is helping him remember what he loves about it." As the afternoon wound down, Marcus helped the children pack up their guitars and straighten the room. When most of the families had left, he lingered, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. "Marcus," Pete said, making the decision easier for him, "would you be interested in joining our group regularly? Not as a student, but as a kind of assistant instructor. These kids could really benefit from working with someone closer to their own age, who understands what they're going through." "I don't know if I'm qualified to teach anyone," Marcus replied. But Pete could hear the hope beneath the self-doubt. "Teaching isn't about being qualified," Harold interjected. "It's about caring enough to share what you know and being willing to learn alongside your students. You did more real teaching today than most people do in years of formal instruction." Margaret nodded in agreement, And from what we observed, you have something special to offer these children. You understand music deeply, but you also understand what it's like to have your plans disrupted, to have to find new ways forward. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Pete could see him wrestling with the decision to risk caring about something again. What if I mess it up? What if I let them down? What if you don't? Pete countered gently. What if you help them discover something about themselves they never knew was there? What if they help you rediscover something you thought you'd lost? Besides, Harold added with a gentle smile, we're all figuring this out as we go. That's part of what makes it an adventure. Marcus looked around the room, taking in the circle of chairs, the small guitars, the music stands filled with simple chord charts and song sheets. My mom always said music saved her life when she was young. Before things got bad for her. Music has saved a lot of lives, Pete said quietly, including mine, though it took me a while to realize it. If I said yes, Marcus asked hesitantly, could I maybe bring some of the music Miguel taught me? Some of the Spanish pieces? Maria might like to hear guitar music from a culture that's part of her heritage. I think that would be wonderful, Pete replied. And I'd love to learn some of those techniques myself, if you'd be willing to teach me. Marcus nodded slowly, and Pete could see the exact moment when he made his decision to trust, to risk caring, to open himself up to the possibility of joy again. Okay, he said simply. I'd like to try. As they locked up the library and prepared to go their separate ways, Pete felt a familiar sense of gratitude for the unexpected directions life could take. He'd started these music sessions thinking he would be helping some children learn basic guitar skills. Instead, he discovered a community of people helping each other heal, learn, and grow in ways that had nothing to do with music technique and everything to do with human connection. Walking Harold and Margaret to their car, Pete reflected on how Marcus's story was both unique and universal. Everyone in their little group had experienced loss, disappointment, and the need to find new ways forward when old plans fell apart. But they were also all discovering that sometimes the detours led to destinations more meaningful than anything they'd originally planned. Same time next week? Harold asked as Margaret helped him into the passenger seat. Wouldn't miss it, Pete replied. I have a feeling it's going to be our most interesting session yet. As he watched them drive away and then walk to his own car, Pete thought about the phone call he'd make to Fawn that evening, sharing the story of Marcus and reflecting on how teaching others had become one of the most fulfilling experiences of his later life. He was finally understanding that the measure of a life well lived wasn't found in personal achievements or public recognition, but in the positive impact you had on other people's stories. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd stop by the music shop and see if Mike had any classical guitar method books. If Marcus was going to be sharing advanced techniques with the group, Pete wanted to be prepared to learn alongside his students. 3 months after Marcus joined their group, Pete arrived at the library on a grey December Saturday to find the community room transformed. Lisa had decorated it with string lights and evergreen garland, and she'd arranged the chairs in concentric semicircles around a small performance area she'd created near the windows. "What's all this?" Pete asked, setting down his guitar case. "Well," Lisa said with a slightly mischievous smile, "word has gotten around about what you all have been doing here. We've had parents asking if they could observe a session and other community members expressing interest in the program. So I thought maybe today could be a kind of informal sharing session. Nothing formal, just a chance for everyone to show their families and friends what they've been learning." Pete felt a familiar flutter of nervousness, but it was different from the performance anxiety he'd sometimes felt during big games. This was more about not wanting to disappoint the children than about his own reputation. "Did you check with Harold and Margaret about this?" he asked. "I called them yesterday." Harold was so excited he could barely contain himself. He said it reminded him of the old days when communities would gather for music evenings in each other's living rooms. Over the next few minutes, their usual group assembled, but they were joined by family members and friends. Maria's parents came, along with her grandmother, who'd driven down from Dayton specifically for the occasion. Jalen's mother had managed to get the afternoon off from her hospital job, and she sat in the front row with his grandmother, both of them beaming with anticipation. Deshawn arrived with his foster family, not just Sarah, but also her husband Tom and their biological daughter Emma, aged 12, who'd been curious about the music program. Most surprisingly, Carlos had convinced several of his friends from school to attend, including a girl named Jessica, who kept glancing at Marcus with obvious interest. Harold and Margaret arrived with their own surprise. Margaret's sister Dorothy had driven over from Louisville, and Harold was carrying a case Pete had never seen before. "What's in there?" Pete asked as Harold carefully set the case down near the performance area. "Something I haven't touched in 2 years, Harold replied, his eyes bright with excitement. "My old Martin. I asked Dr. Peterson if I could try playing again just for today. He said as long as I don't push myself too hard, it might actually be therapeutic." Pete watched Harold open the case to reveal a beautiful vintage acoustic guitar, obviously well-loved and carefully maintained. The wood gleamed with decades of playing, and Pete could see where Harold's fingers had worn smooth grooves in the fretboard. "Harold, are you sure? I don't want you to strain yourself or—" "Pete, my boy," Harold interrupted gently. "I've been thinking about this for weeks. My hands may shake, and I may not be able to play the way I used to, but I'd like to try. Music has been the soundtrack to my entire adult life. I want to be part of making music one more time, not just talking about it." As the room filled with people, Pete gathered his regular students for a quick planning session. They'd been working on several songs over the past few weeks, building their skills and confidence, but this was the first time they'd be playing for an audience of more than just each other. "Is everyone nervous?" he asked. "A little," Maria admitted, "but excited too. My grandmother has been wanting to hear me play guitar." "I'm not nervous," Jalen declared, though his slightly shaky voice suggested otherwise. "My mum said she's been bragging about me at work." Deshawn was characteristically quiet, but Pete noticed him checking and rechecking his guitar tuning with more attention than usual. Marcus stood slightly apart, his own guitar case at his feet, looking uncertain. "Marcus," Pete said, drawing him into the circle, "you're part of this group now. Whatever happens today, we're all in it together." "I just don't want to show off or make the little kids feel bad," Marcus said quietly. "My level is so much higher than theirs." "That's exactly why you belong here," Harold interjected, having overheard. "The best musicians aren't the ones who play the most complicated pieces. They're the ones who understand how to serve the music and support the other musicians. Today, your job is to help everyone else sound their best." Pete nodded in agreement. "Harold's right. Think of yourself as the foundation that everyone else can build on. When you play with restraint and focus on supporting the group, you're demonstrating real musicianship." Lisa called for everyone's attention, and the room settled into expectant quiet. She gave a brief introduction, explaining how the music program had evolved and thanking Pete, Harold, and Margaret for their contributions to the community. "What you're about to hear," Lisa concluded, "isn't a polished performance. It's a sharing of what happens when people of different ages and backgrounds come together around something they love. It's about learning, growing, and supporting each other through music." Pete stepped forward with his guitar, feeling the weight of all the eyes on him, but also the support of his students and friends. "We thought we'd start with a song that means something special to Harold and Margaret, and that we've all been learning together. It's called September Song. Day, he began the opening chords, and Harold, despite his trembling hands, joined in with a harmony line that was simpler than what he might have played in his prime, but was perfectly suited to the song's emotional content. Margaret sang the melody in a voice that wavered slightly with age, but carried decades of love and memory. As the song continued, the children joined in one by one. Maria added a gentle harmony she'd been practicing, her young voice blending beautifully with Margaret's. Jalen kept a steady rhythm on his guitar, providing the foundation that allowed the others to add their own touches. Deshawn, who'd been working on a simple finger-picking pattern, contributed a delicate counter-melody that surprised everyone with its sophistication. Marcus, true to Pete's guidance, played a supporting role, adding subtle bass notes and harmonic fills that enriched the overall sound without drawing attention to his superior technical skills. But Pete could see the joy on his face as he participated in creating something beautiful with the group. When the song ended, the room erupted in applause that was both appreciative and deeply moved. Pete saw tears in several eyes, including those of Maria's grandmother, who was whispering to her daughter in Spanish. "That was beautiful," called out Jalen's mother. "I had no idea he'd learned so much." For the next 40 minutes, the group shared a variety of songs, each highlighting different students' developing skills. They performed House of the Rising Sun, with Deshawn taking the lead guitar part he'd mastered. They did a group version of This Land Is Your Land that got the entire audience singing along. Maria sang a Spanish lullaby her grandmother had taught her, accompanying herself on guitar, while Marcus provided subtle harmonic support that honored the song's cultural roots. The most moving moment came when Harold, his hands shaking but his determination unwavering, played a solo version of Blackbird. His technique was far from perfect. He missed several chord changes and had to simplify passages that would have been easy for him a few years earlier. But the emotion in his playing was profound, and when Margaret began singing along softly, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "This is for my Margaret," Harold said when the song ended. "For 53 years of dancing with me, even when I stepped on her feet." After the formal sharing session ended, the gathering naturally evolved into a community music circle. Some of the parents revealed that they played instruments and were invited to join in. Carlos's friend Jessica turned out to be a talented singer, and she and Marcus found themselves harmonizing on several songs while she watched him with obvious admiration. Pete found himself sitting back, watching the organic way music was bringing people together across generations and backgrounds. Maria's grandmother shared a traditional Guatemalan song, teaching the melody to anyone who wanted to learn. Jalen's mother had a beautiful voice and led the group in several gospel songs that had everyone clapping and swaying. Dorothy, Margaret's sister, surprised everyone by producing a harmonica from her purse and adding blues-inspired flourishes to several of the songs. Even Lisa got into the act, revealing that she played ukulele and knew an impressive repertoire of folk songs. As the afternoon wound down, Pete noticed Marcus sitting with Carlos and Jessica, all three of them with guitars, working out an arrangement of a contemporary song they all knew. The sight filled him with particular satisfaction. Marcus was not only playing music again, but he was connecting with peers and allowing himself to be part of a social group. "Pete," Harold called softly from nearby. "Could I have a word?" They stepped slightly away from the music making, and Harold's expression was serious, despite the joy of the afternoon. "I wanted to thank you," Harold began. "Not just for today, but for these past few months. When Margaret and I walked into that music shop, I thought my relationship with music was over. I thought the Parkinson's meant I'd never be able to contribute anything meaningful again. Harold, you've contributed more than you could possibly know." "But that's just it," Harold continued. "You helped me realize that contribution isn't always about what you can do with your hands. It's about what you can share from your heart and your experience." These children, Marcus, even you've all taught me that there are many ways to make music, and playing an instrument is just one of them. Pete felt his throat tighten with emotion. You've taught me something too, Harold. You've shown me that wisdom and love can be more powerful than technical skill, and that sharing what you know is often more important than what you can personally achieve. Margaret joined them, having overheard part of their conversation. You know, Pete, when we first met you, I sensed that you were carrying a heavy burden of regret. Do you still feel that weight as much? Pete considered her question as he watched the continuing music-making around them. Maria was teaching Deshawn a chord progression while her grandmother watched with obvious pride. Jalen was showing his mother the strumming pattern he'd learned, his face glowing with excitement. Marcus was laughing at something Jessica had said, his guitar across his lap, looking more relaxed and happy than Pete had ever seen him. The regrets are still there, Pete said finally. I don't think they'll ever completely go away, and maybe they shouldn't. But they don't define me anymore. What defines me now is this. These relationships, this music, these moments of connection and growth. That sounds like wisdom to me, Margaret said with a warm smile. As families began to pack up and say their goodbyes, Pete found himself surrounded by expressions of gratitude and requests for when the next session would be. Several parents asked about getting their children involved in the program, and Lisa was already talking about expanding to multiple days of the week. Mr. Pete, Maria said, approaching with her parents and grandmother, my grandmother wants to say something to you, but her English isn't very good. Can I translate? Of course. Maria's grandmother spoke in rapid Spanish, her eyes bright with emotion. Maria listened carefully, then turned to Pete. She says that music is the language of the heart, and that you have helped her granddaughter find her voice in both music and in life. She says you are a good teacher because you don't just teach songs, you teach children to believe in themselves. Pete knelt down to Maria's grandmother's eye level and took her hands gently in his. Gracias, he said in his limited Spanish. Su nieta es muy especial. The elderly woman's face broke into a radiant smile, and she patted Pete's cheek affectionately before saying something else to Maria. She says you have a good heart, and that good hearts make the best music. After everyone had left, Pete helped Lisa and Harold and Margaret clean up the room and put away the instruments. The library felt quiet after the afternoon's energy, but it was a peaceful quiet, filled with the lingering echoes of music and laughter. So, Lisa said as they finished stacking chairs, I think it's safe to say this was a success. More than a success, Pete replied. It was transformative. For all of us. Harold, moving slowly but with obvious satisfaction, closed his guitar case for what he suspected might be the last time he'd be able to play publicly. But instead of sadness, his expression showed deep contentment. You know what the most beautiful part was, he said to Pete and Margaret. It wasn't any individual performance. It was the moment when everyone realized they were part of something bigger than themselves. That's what real music does. It reminds us that we're all connected. As they walked out to their cars in the gathering December dusk, Pete reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a man defined by his past mistakes, struggling to find meaning and purpose in his later years. Today, he was part of a community that looked forward rather than backward, that focused on what people could become rather than what they'd done wrong. Same time next week? Margaret asked, though they all knew the answer. Wouldn't miss it, Pete replied, though I think we might need a bigger room. Driving home through the Cincinnati streets, past the stadiums and landmarks that had once been sources of pain and regret, Pete felt a profound sense of peace. He'd found his way back to music, but more importantly, he'd found his way back to hope to community, to the understanding that every day offered new opportunities to make a positive difference in someone else's life. That evening, he called Fawn to share the story of the afternoon's musical gathering. As he described the children's growth, Harold's courage in playing again, despite his limitations, and the way music had brought an entire community together in celebration and support, Pete heard something in his daughter's voice that he hadn't heard in years. Pride. "Dad," she said when he finished his account, "I think you've found your calling. Not the calling you thought you wanted, but the one you actually needed." Later, sitting in his apartment with the Martin guitar across his lap, Pete played September Song one more time, thinking about Harold and Margaret, about Maria and Marcus, and all the children who were learning that music could be a bridge between who they were and who they might become. He played it softly, not as a performance, but as a prayer of gratitude for unexpected second chances and the profound truth that it's never too late to discover new ways to serve, to love, and to make a meaningful contribution to the world. Outside his window, the lights of Cincinnati twinkled in the winter darkness, and Pete Rose smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to teach, to learn, and to create beauty alongside the community that had become his greatest achievement.